Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Big Bill, Big Problems. This is our presentation on how the One Big Beautiful Bill Act is going to impact working Kansans. My name is John Wilson, and I'm the president and CEO of Kansas Action for Children. KAC is a nonprofit, nonpartisan children's advocacy organization working to make Kansas a state where every child has the opportunity to grow up healthy and thrive. I'm thrilled to be joined by colleagues from other organizations and other colleagues from KAC. Out here filming the event tonight is Jessica Herrera-Russell, our Senior Communications Manager. At the end is Adrian Olnick, our Vice President, and then next to her is Nathan Kessler, who's our Principal Economist. Also, a special guest, everyone, from Washington, D.C. He's already been crisscrossing the state from Garden City to Hutchinson to Iola, and now here in Manhattan, the One Big Beautiful Bill itself, all 867 pages of it. And you might be looking at that and says, that really looks like a gift. And spoiler alert, it's not a gift really for anybody in this room. Most of the people in this room, I would say, in fact. But you'll learn more about that. So just a few months ago, this bill was passed by Congress on razor-thin margins on July 3rd. And the reason it barely had enough votes to pass is because it included massive cuts to programs like Medicaid and SNAP, which is a nutrition assistance program, as well as other types of tax cuts that will run up the U.S. national debt. And you might have heard about this bill in the media or perhaps through friends and family or even politicians on both sides of the aisle. But today we have the Alliance for a Healthy Kansas and Kansas Appleseed and Kansas Action for Children here to talk about the specific changes in the bill, because I imagine you haven't heard the full story. You haven't had a chance to read the fine print on this one. But before we get into the specifics of the bill, I just want to provide some framing comments about the bill as a whole, starting with the name itself. One Big Beautiful Bill. You know, there are many things in this world that look beautiful from afar. I think about maybe a thunderstorm on the horizon, huge clouds. In a way, the size and the potential power behind it is really beautiful. But those clouds are also a warning to us, because that storm might bring a little bit of rain, but maybe it brings strong winds, maybe it brings damaging hail, and we just don't know what it's going to bring. But if it does bring those things, we often are able to get out and assess the damage and clean up our house and see how our neighbors are doing. And I got to tell you, this big, beautiful bill, there are a lot of people who are actually admiring what this bill will do, who are applauding the cuts to programs that serve children and families, admiring the way that the taxes benefit the wealthy few. But I'm afraid to tell you all that many of the provisions of this bill, once they go into effect, are going to show that this is in fact a devastating storm. And like a lot of storms, there are some who are able to ride it out. They have a safe place to go. But there are a lot of people that don't have any safe place to go. So what we're doing tonight is providing that warning to you all here, and that's what we've been doing the whole week, has been traveling the state to talk about what this bill will do to families in Kansas. So you're going to hear a lot of facts and figures. But if you aren't able to retain all of that, there are a couple of things that we want you to remember, and they're helpfully printed on this poster board next to Adrian. The first is that 26,000 Kansans will lose their health coverage due to cuts to the Medicaid program and the Affordable Care Act marketplace. 27,000 Kansans will lose their SNAP benefits because of new arbitrary requirements. And if SNAP ends altogether in the state because of the federal government's mandate that states pick up more of the share, then 187,000 Kansans will face hunger and be forced to rely on the goodwill of their neighbors to have enough to eat. And lastly, 25,000 Kansas children, all of whom are American citizens, will lose their federal child tax credit because their parents don't have a Social Security number. So that means $2,000 less per child each year that they could be using on housing, on food, on transportation, and all the things that are needed for families to function. And sadly, the impacts won't stop there. They'll touch every neighborhood, every community, and really every state in this country. But I'm a Midwesterner, we're Midwesterners, and it would be unbecoming of me to just end on such a sour note. I want to be a little bit of an optimist. And so I want to end with this. After every storm, there are good people out there that will step up to help those who are impacted, those who are hurt. And that's especially true in Kansas. No matter what corner of the state you live in, someone will lend a hand, give some extra supplies, or just give you a hug when things feel really tough. And you being here today is the first step in preparing those who are going to be impacted by this bill. And there's still time to change some things, but really it's going to take all of us working together. And our hope tonight is that what you learn here doesn't stay here and doesn't stay with you. I think we've all heard that phrase that knowledge is power, but knowledge is really just knowledge. It only becomes power when we take action on that. And we need you to start talking about what this bill is going to do once you leave here tonight. And you'll be equipped, thankfully, with lots of helpful information because of my colleagues up here. We're going to share a little bit about the bill with you, and then we're going to leave some time for questions because we know you have those questions. So thank you again for being here. I want to turn it over to my colleague, April Holman, who's the Executive Director of the Alliance for a Healthy Kansas.
Hi, good evening. So I am April Holman with the Alliance for a Healthy Kansas, and I wanted to introduce my colleagues so that you would get to know all of us. You're going to be hearing from Marissa Alcantar in just a few minutes. She is our policy and advocacy manager. We have Ms. Sarah Al-Shuraya, our community organizer, who is in the back, and you might have seen her at the table as you walked in. Lacey Kennett is our director of communications, and Sean Gatewood he helps us with our community organizing and advocacy at the State House as well. So it's my job to talk with you just a little bit about the changes and really cuts to healthcare that are going to impact access. They're going to impact providers who provide services in Kansas, and they're going to have an impact really on our economy as well. So I'm starting with Medicaid and talking about those changes. Marissa's going to talk about some things that have come because of H.R. 1, the big, beautiful bill, in terms of those marketplace plans that you would get if you went to healthcare.gov. One of the things that I'd like to share with you is not all of the Medicaid changes are going to impact Kansas. So there are some things that you might have heard quite a bit about in the news, like work reporting requirements and more frequent eligibility redetermination that only apply to states that have enacted Medicaid expansion already. But that does not mean that Kansas gets off scot-free with this bill. And quite to the contrary, we see that this is going to cut about 9% of our Medicaid funding that we receive today from that budget. So it's significant. Just to give you some scope, Missouri, that already has done Medicaid expansion, the amount that they're having cut is about 12% of their Medicaid budget. So not really that different, and certainly we're going to feel those impacts in Kansas. I want to tell you a little bit about just the biggest provisions that impact us with the largest dollar amounts. First is the way that Kansas and other states pay for their Medicaid program is going to be restricted now that H.R. 1 has passed. So we have used provider taxes and state-directed payments to help bolster the amount that hospitals and other providers receive for Medicaid reimbursement, and we have paid for that with provider taxes. Those are going to be heavily restricted now, and we're not going to be able to increase what we bring in the future because of H.R. 1. The other things that are really going to be a noticeable difference are the end to measures that would streamline enrollment and re-enrollment, particularly for children. That's going to be a significant impact. There's going to be a limitation of coverage for people who are already sick. We see this often with people who show up and they're in the emergency room and realize that they would qualify for Medicaid. There's also people who might need to go to a nursing home and sign up for Medicaid at that moment, and they're going to have less of their cost covered because of H.R. 1. We also know that there are significant restrictions to women's reproductive health and where women can get that care. And I'm not talking about controversial measures here. I'm just talking about basic women's reproductive health and the types of institutions that are able to provide that under H.R. 1. So I've told you a little bit about the policy changes, but I also want to tell you a little bit about the impacts. You can see from the board that we're expecting just from this bill for about 26,000 Kansans to lose their health coverage over the course of the next 10 years. About 12,000 of those people will be losing their coverage due to the changes in H.R. 1 that have to do with Medicaid. Another 12,000 people are expected to lose their coverage because of the changes to the Affordable Care Act plans. And an additional about 1,600 people are going to be losing their coverage because of changes to Medicare and other smaller provisions that are part of this bill, but maybe haven't been talked about as much. I think that one of the things that I want to just put on your radar, and I think you'll hear this again from my colleagues, is that not all of these provisions are going to kick in at once. And as a matter of fact, there have been very intentional moves to push things out past the 2026 elections and past the 2028 elections. So we want you all to know that these changes, cuts, and lack of funding for medical care that is coming to Kansas are because of this bill, because there's going to be a lot of time that happens between now and when we really start to see the impacts. And I think that was by design. One of the other things that I just want to flag for you is that there are going to be really tough choices that are pushed down to state policymakers because we are going to see about $3.9 billion less in our Medicaid program over the course of 10 years. And that's going to mean that policymakers are going to have to look at things that are optional within the Medicaid program. The largest dollar, like the largest ticket, is those services that are provided to people who have disabilities to enable them to stay in their homes instead of being institutionalized. Those are called home and community-based services. And although nobody wants to see those cut, policymakers are not going to have a lot of good choices, and that might be something that is very much in jeopardy. I'm going to stop there and pass the microphone over to my colleague Marissa to share more about those private plans.
Thank you so much, April. So excited to be here with you all tonight in Manhattan. My name is Marissa. I'm going to go over the ACA provisions that April was talking about here. So because of the One Big Beautiful Bill, there are several new provisions that have instilled new requirements on the marketplace. And up first is that the open enrollment period is going to be shortened by 1 month, running from November 1st to December 15th. And a lot of states, open enrollment runs until January 15th. However, moving forward, it will be shortened until December 15th. Marketplace is also going to deny premium tax credits to people who haven't filed the correct tax form with the IRS previously, so a little bit more administrative requirements on people before they can even access those premium tax credits on the marketplace. There are also new requirements that have established a clawback of premium tax credits if enrollees calculated their incomes incorrectly. Previously, there was a cap on how much individuals would have to pay back in that clawback. Now they will have to pay it back in full. They're also eliminating automatic re-enrollment in Marketplace plans starting in 2028. Marketplace enrollees must update and verify all of their eligibility information before the end of the open enrollment period, before they are even able to access those premium tax credits. If they don't get that information updated, they will lose access to those premium tax credits. So we're kind of seeing a trend of making sure that individuals have a lot of administrative requirements on them before they can even access the care that they need. There is going to be no provisional coverage for new Marketplace applicants. New applicants to the Marketplace must provide all of their paperwork proving their eligibility before they can get access to the premium tax credits. So even individuals that are newly to the Marketplace will have these administrative burdens on them as well. There's going to be no special enrollment periods for certain income levels. Previously, those with incomes below 150% of the federal poverty level were able to enroll in the Marketplace at any time. However, they will not be able to do that moving forward. Marketplace tax credit eligibility for lawfully present immigrants is going to be limited moving forward as well. Starting in 2027, only green card holders, Cuban and Haitian immigrants, and a few other limited groups will be eligible for the Marketplace. And finally, this is a big one, not entirely related to the One Big Beautiful Bill, but no less important. These are the enhanced premium tax credits. These enhanced premium tax credits have been in place on the Marketplace since the COVID-19 pandemic, and they're set to expire at the end of this year unless Congress acts. Right now, there has been no move to extend these premium tax credits. They are kind of in discussions at this time. However, premiums are set to increase by over 75% for the average enrollee without the access to these enhanced premium tax credits. And the majority of Kansans on the Marketplace have access to these enhanced premium tax credits. If they're not extended, they'll have widespread consequences for those that get their health insurance through the Marketplace. As a result, 108,000 Kansans are expected to lose Marketplace coverage over the next 10 years. And due to all of these provisions that we have discussed here tonight, people will be prevented from enrolling in and even priced out of the Marketplace over the next 10 years. That's all I have for you on the Marketplace. I'm going to pass things over to Jamie at Kansas Appleseed.
Thank you, Marissa. Good evening. I'm Jamie Reaver. I'm the Executive Director of Kansas Appleseed, and I'd like to introduce my colleague, Logan Stensing. He is our Civic Engagement Manager, has been on the job for 2 weeks, and we have him on the road already. So I want to start by telling you a little bit about who we are at Kansas Appleseed, and then I'm going to talk about the impacts the Big Beautiful Bill has on SNAP benefits. Kansas Appleseed is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization dedicated to the belief that every single Kansan should live in thriving, inclusive, and just communities. We're working to fight hunger, fight poverty, and fight injustice. And we do this through research, advocacy, and legal action. So what does that look like? We're working to fix the foster care system so that the kids in the state care aren't further traumatized by the very system meant to protect them. We're working to reform the youth and adult justice systems so that those who interact with the state's court systems have a chance for rehabilitation. We're working to increase civic engagement by increasing voter engagement and voter turnout in communities. And we're working to end hunger by increasing access to food assistance programs, which is what I'm going to talk about tonight. One of the best ways to address poverty and hunger in America is through the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, known as SNAP, also formerly known as food stamps. SNAP puts groceries on the tables of just under 200,000 Kansans every year. We should all be proud that one of our state's greatest residents, Senator Bob Dole, along with his colleague, Senator George McGovern, were leaders in expanding SNAP access across the entire United States with bipartisan support. They knew 50 years ago what we know today. Hunger is real, and it's going to take all of us working together to solve it. Unfortunately, Senator Dole's legacy has been under attack for years, and even more so this year under the One Big Beautiful Act. So I'm going to talk about the different provisions within the bill that are going to make more Kansans hungry. First, the bill shifts costs from the federal government to the states. Until now, the federal government paid 50% of the administrative costs of running SNAP. Starting in fiscal year 2027, that reimbursement rate drops to 25%. That means Kansas will pay 75% of our administrative expenses, a new cost of about $20 million every year just to keep the program running. But that's not all. For the first time ever, states will also have to pay part of the actual SNAP benefits when their payment error rates exceed federal targets. I'm going to say that again. States will have to pay part of the actual SNAP benefits when their payment error rates exceed federal targets. These error rates are measured how accurately state agencies determine eligibility and benefit allotments to Kansas. And so this error rate can include overpayments or underpayments. And they're errors. They're not fraud. And a lot of times in the news, some elected officials will want to conflate the two. But there's fraud and there's error rates. And these error rates are simply human mistakes by maybe transposing a number. So Kansas's current error rate is about 10%. So under the new rules, that means we would have to cover 15% of total SNAP benefits. That's another $40 million per year. So I want to point out in some years, when we look maybe a 25-year look back, there have been some years when Kansas's error rate is less than 1%. And in those years, we would not have to pay any of the SNAP benefits. But that kind of unpredictability also could wreak havoc on the state budget, not knowing year to year what our portion might be. So between administrative costs and the benefits, the bill would shift about $60 million in new annual costs onto Kansas taxpayers. This bill has promised us all tax relief, but that's not happening. This either means cuts to other state services or higher taxes. And here's what's even more troubling. Over the last decade, Kansas lawmakers have already been successful increasing barriers to SNAP participation through new statutes, known as the HOPE Act in 2016, and this new cost shift could really be the final blow to SNAP in Kansas. A massive price tag like this could give our opponents the excuse to start with the program, stop funding it altogether, and create more barriers by pushing SNAP toward a slow death by 1,000 cuts. So in the worst case scenario, SNAP could cease to exist in our state, and that's 187,000 Kansans who won't have access to additional food. So if that's not worrisome enough, we're going to move over to work requirements. To keep or become eligible for SNAP benefits, certain people would have to meet work requirements that include working, volunteering, or participating in an education or technical training program for at least 20 hours per week. And you have to report those work requirements to the federal government. I know that for some, it's easy to look at work requirements and think, that makes sense. But the reality of who is on SNAP needs to be highlighted. 65% of participants are families with children. 36% are families with members who are older adults or are disabled. And 44% are working families. That's not the picture that some elected officials would have you believe about who's receiving SNAP benefits. They're people just like you and me. Here's a couple of reasons why this rule is harmful. It really ignores many real-world obstacles to work, such as lack of stable housing, lack of affordable childcare, transportation, and of course, seasonal employment. And having so many rural communities with farms in Kansas, we know what seasonal employment means. This also disproportionately impacts individuals living with disabilities. State screening processes often fail to adequately identify people with disabilities who should be exempt, leading them to losing benefits due to paperwork failures rather than an inability to work. Research going back decades, we have seen it in recent years in other states, shows that work requirements don't increase long-term employment. They just reduce participation in SNAP by creating an immense amount of paperwork to prove that you qualify. One last thing on work requirements. In the past, Congress recognized that some groups face unique barriers to employment and exempted them from work requirements. So veterans, former foster youth, and individuals experiencing homelessness. This bill removes all of those exemptions. This means people who've already sacrificed for our country, foster kids aging out of the system who we know have no supports when they reach adulthood, and those without stable housing may now will no longer receive those SNAP benefits. Another major change to the loss of eligibility is that for many lawfully present citizens, lawfully present non-citizens are refugees, asylum seekers, and trafficking survivors. Under the bill, many of these residents will lose that support despite being legally present and authorized to work. These are families who have fled persecution from their own countries and are trying to rebuild their lives. Taking away food assistance from them increases hunger and instability for some of our state's most vulnerable residents. In 2023, that was about 3,000 people living in our state who received SNAP benefits who identified as lawfully present non-citizens. And these changes, they also have a secondary consequence. They also impact our local economies, because when you think of those 3,000 Kansans who will no longer receive food assistance benefits, that means that it's 3,000 people who will not be able to use those SNAP benefits at their local grocery store. And so it's going to have just a trickle-down effect that's going to even put our own communities at greater risk. There's one more area I really want to highlight, and I think for those of you here in Manhattan, especially familiar with K-State research, you might know what I'm about to talk about. This bill also eliminates SNAP-Ed, the nutrition education arm of SNAP. SNAP-Ed provides evidence-based education to help low-income families, helps them stretch their food dollars, cook healthier meals, and prevent diet-related diseases like diabetes and heart disease. Make America healthy again. In Kansas, this meant 30 full-time SNAP-Ed agents teaching nutrition across the state have lost their jobs, and the families they served lost a proven tool for improving health. To sum up, this bill is a disaster and will hurt almost 200,000 Kansans, hurt local economies, and allow the state legislature to make decisions about who gets food and who doesn't. But like my colleague John, we got to have some optimism because I believe in you and I believe in Kansas. We can fight back, and we need to fight back. We need to spread the word by sharing what you've learned with neighbors, congregations, and local organizations. Contact your state legislator and members of Congress to oppose future harmful SNAP cuts. And most importantly, share your stories. Personal experiences are some of the most powerful ways to get elected officials to pay attention. And let's work together to make sure Senator Dole's legacy lives on.
Good evening. I'm Adrienne from Kansas Action for Children. That was a lot of information. And one of the first questions that I know I had after listening to that the first night, and that you might be asking yourself is, why? Why did these cuts need to happen? Why would Congress so drastically need to cut Medicaid, SNAP, government insurance through the marketplace? It's because they wanted to pay for a large packet of tax cuts that is also in this bill. But even with the big cuts in spending, there are many ways they also cut taxes that will amount to a $4 trillion addition to the national debt. Contained in this bill's hundreds of pages are substantial tax cuts for the wealthiest Americans, and we're going to describe who those are. But any benefit to the working class that they'll see from this bill is watered down by exceptions and a lot of fine print. In fact, it's very likely that when the full impact of this bill is realized, many of us in this room will be worse off than we are today. So we're going to continue to dig into this fine print and find out what this bill really means for your and my financial security. The most talked about tax cuts, the bonus deductions for tips, overtime, and the one for senior citizens, are temporary and are set to expire after tax year 2028. And while eliminating taxes on these income sources was really popular talk on the campaign trail, this bill fails to deliver. Paychecks, as you might have seen if you've had some overtime, still have the same taxes taken out. And taxpayers, all of us, will have to wait until it's time to file our taxes before seeing any benefit, which will likely be smaller than we think. Most, but not all, tipped workers and those with overtime will be allowed to deduct a portion of these earnings, while seniors can take an additional deduction of $6,000. One especially note for overtime workers, the fine print really needs to be understood before assuming how much you're going to benefit from that. All of these deductions will reduce your adjusted gross income and could lead to paying fewer taxes for those who qualify. But for folks struggling to pay the bills or put food on the table every month, this offers no relief in their everyday lives. Well, I told you we'd bring some good news tonight. We're trying to do that. Through 2029, you can now deduct up to $40,000 for taxes paid for state and local governments. But like much of this bill, it's only going to benefit those highest earners who will even get close to finding that useful. Also, a new tax-preferred savings account called Trump Accounts comes with a temporary pilot program that contributes $1,000 for any baby born between January 1st of this year until the end of 2028. These accounts can be opened for any child with a Social Security number, and families can contribute an extra $5,000 each year to these tax-preferred accounts. But as the child turns 18, they don't turn into a college savings account. They turn into what is like a traditional IRA. So while we were initially interested in some of the first designs of these accounts, which were different, the final version that made it into the bill is just really disappointing. Other programs like 529 accounts, or even some states have put into place baby bonds or children's savings accounts. Those are much preferred mechanisms to help support children as they get older. There are also a few other things in this bill that just don't quite deliver, like the deduction for car loan interest. Be careful on that one. The reductions for many people with the child tax credit and the standard deduction, and some other things that my colleague Nathan is going to close us out and share with you tonight about those.
Thank you, Adrian, and thank all of you for being here. You just got to hear about some of the fun and the flashy tax cuts, but unfortunately for all of you, now you get me. The core and most expensive piece of this legislation is making the 2017 tax cuts permanent. This means that many people may not feel like they're getting a tax cut at all because this bill does not change your tax rate. However, like the temporary deductions that Adrian talked about, there may be some things that offer you a little bit of tax relief. The change that will affect almost everybody in this room is a small, very small, increase in the standard deduction. While 1 in 10 taxpayers itemize, the other 9 opt for this standard deduction. Previously, that was $15,000 for single filers and $30,000 for those married filing jointly. Good news, now you get an additional $750 or $1,500 respectively. The federal child tax credit was also increased in this bill from $2,000 to $2,200. But you will need to make at least $29,000 to take advantage of the full amount of the credit, leaving many low-income families out of the boost altogether. Even worse, about 25,000 Kansas kids are going to lose the credit. Previously, any child with a Social Security number was eligible for the CTC, but new eligibility requirements in H.R. 1 require that at least one parent also have a Social Security number, excluding many children of immigrants, regardless of immigration status. For those of you that pay for child or dependent care, the Child and Dependent Care Tax Credit received an enhancement that will allow you to claim more of your expenses at tax time. The lowest income families can now claim 50% of their expenses, with that percentage decreasing as income rises. Previously, that starting point was 35%. This will provide a small but noticeable help at tax season for those of you that pay for childcare. However, as a non-refundable credit, those with the highest tax liability benefit the most. Low-income families with the most need are unlikely to feel the effect of this enhancement. And finally, the estate tax exemption was increased from $14 million to $15 million. This means that the first $15 million of an inheritance is now tax-free, which is excellent news for those of you in the audience set to inherit $14.99 million. But for the rest of you, I'm guessing the $14 million would have been sufficient. This change alone is expected to cost the nation more than $200 billion. And unfortunately, that is just the tip of the $4 trillion debt iceberg that Adrian alluded to. Despite major cuts to critical programs that you've just heard about, this bill is expected to add $3.4 trillion to the national debt over the next 10 years. And that's before you include the interest on that. The driving force behind this new debt is less about new spending, but I promise you there's plenty of that, so don't worry. And it's more about decreased revenues. When the 2017 tax cuts were signed into law, they were set to expire at the end of this year. That's the only way they could get around the filibuster at the time. To get around the filibuster this time, the Senate Majority Leader claimed that extending the status quo doesn't cost anything, when the reality is that it's more like you or me going on vacation. Just because our status quo for a week is to spend an additional $200 a day doesn't mean we won't go broke if we keep doing that when we come back to the real world. This is the situation that the U.S. now finds itself in. We've been giving up a lot of revenue from the wealthiest Americans for years, and this bill aims to keep that party rolling. Payments to cover interest on the national debt are already the third largest item in the U.S. budget behind Social Security and Medicare. This bill pours gasoline on that fire and leaves future generations to deal with the consequences. Paying for these costly tax cuts is going to lead directly to higher prices for everybody in this room. Besides the extreme cuts to SNAP and Medicaid, this bill eliminated tax credits meant for renewable energy projects. At a time when demand for energy is expected to rise rapidly, failure to invest in energy technologies is going to lead to higher costs for everybody. One estimate suggests that Kansas households will be spending more than $200 a year more on power by 2030, and more than $650 more by 2035. Oil and natural gas alone simply aren't going to provide enough power to keep prices low as the population grows, data centers get built, and more electric vehicles hit the road. We need diversified energy sources to keep prices low, and Kansas would have seen massive benefits from investment in wind and solar technologies. And it's not just higher electric bills, but also higher borrowing costs. And I got a disclaimer, this might get a little bit complicated, but bear with me, this is good stuff. As I said, this adds trillions to the national debt. And because of the debt's relationship with long-term interest rates, when the government lives beyond its means, we all pay the price. As interest payments on the debt increase faster than income, that debt looks riskier to the investors that buy the treasury bonds. This drives up interest rates, and those interest rates trickle through the economy and raise rates on things like mortgages, car loans, and business borrowing. And I hate to be the one to tell all of you, but that's the only trickle down you're getting from this bill. And I'm going to end with something a bit more concrete, and that's tariffs. And while those are not directly related to this bill, tariffs are an important piece of the broader economic reforms that we're seeing from this administration. Notably, tariffs are expected to generate about $3.3 trillion in revenue to the government if left in place over the next 10 years. And that's almost exactly how much this bill costs. Now, tariffs are essentially a sales tax that businesses pass on to consumers. And as a sales tax, they hit people hardest when the majority of their paycheck has to go toward everyday expenses. With 40% of the benefits for Kansans in this bill going to households earning more than $305,000 a year, that sounds to me like the import tax is meant to cover the cost of tax cuts for the wealthy. Consider that 75% of toys sold in the U.S. come from China, while 99% of all coffee consumed here is imported. That means tariffs are raising prices on everything from breakfast to holiday purchases, and people are already struggling enough without self-imposed inflation, making trips to the grocery store harder on all of us. The bottom line is that this is a bill that steals from the future to pad the pockets of the wealthy today. It was sold as the only way to prevent a tax hike on all Americans, but that's just not true. Congress could easily have extended the tax cuts for those making under $400,000 a year and cut the cost of the bill by more than half. Instead, we got a bill that takes critical resources from vulnerable populations, raises costs for Kansans, and adds $4 trillion to the national debt. Sure, there are some things in here that will help some, but not all, working-class families. But at what cost? Many families are going to lose food assistance, health insurance, or the child tax credit. Some will lose all three at once with devastating consequences for their financial security. By one estimate, the bottom 20% of earners in the state are actually going to see a slight increase in their tax burden. All this is to say that this bill is extremely costly and the benefits are heavily skewed toward the top. Future generations of Kansans will be left to contend with higher electric bills, higher interest rates, and an economy that just doesn't work for them.
That's a lot. I want to say that the Alliance for a Healthy Kansas has fans and stress balls out there if your blood is boiling after hearing this. Just real quick, if you know somebody that will be impacted by what you've heard tonight, I wonder if you could just stand up. If you know somebody who's going to be impacted by higher borrowing costs, or may lose health coverage, or may pay astronomically higher prices for health coverage, would you stand up? I'm seeing nearly everybody standing up if they're able to. This is a big deal, everyone, and we're just getting started. You please have a seat. Last note is if you've been keeping track of people's comments, there's 40 million here, a couple more million here that the state has to pick up in cost. And in case you're not familiar, unlike the federal government, the state government cannot deficit spend. We have limitations, and so that means your choices are cut spending or raise revenue. And there are limited options for raising revenue in Kansas. You could certainly increase property taxes, but lawmakers have already really decided we can't do that. You could raise sales taxes, which will hurt families living on low wages, and that's not politically popular. And then there's income taxes, and Kansas lawmakers in recent years have removed tax brackets and have really restricted how we can raise revenue from income taxes. And even if we didn't spend a dime more in the coming legislative session, in the next several years, we will be in the red with current spending. So we cannot absorb these things without cuts. And it is real. And we have already begun to have conversations with state lawmakers about these federal changes and how it's going to make their lives harder. And so that's why leaving here tonight, it's not just about sending a note to the federal delegation. It is maintaining contact with your state representative and state senator to help them understand this bill is going to make their lives harder. And this will be my final comment. As time goes on, people often forget the legislation that impacts their current reality. And really, many lawmakers who supported that legislation want us to forget those things. But we cannot let them forget that. We have to continue to make these linkages. So we're going to be around for a while after the event. We'd love to hear from you and have further discussion. And again, thank you for being here, and a special shout out to the League of Women Voters folks who shifted your plans to be here tonight as well. Thank you so much.